Lear, who's our moderator today. Go ahead, Christy.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this discussion about advocacy and archives. We're going to get things started with presentations from Bryan Whitledge, the archivist for University Digital Records at the Central Michigan University, and Catherine Newsome, the state archivist and executive director of the Louisiana State Archives. So after that, we'll have some discussion about the Archives on the Hill's advocacy initiative, and even just some general discussion regarding advocacy. There'll be plenty of time for Q&A at the end, so please feel free to drop any questions that you have in the chat box. Lisa and I will be monitoring that throughout the presentation so we can make sure any questions that you have can get asked and answered. So our first presenter this afternoon is Bryan Whitledge. He has worked in archives and special collections libraries in various capacities since 2006. In 2016, he was appointed the first archivist for University Digital Records at Central Michigan University. Since 2021, he served as the Public Services Librarian at CMU's Clark Historical Library. Bryan is involved regionally and nationally in archival associations with a specific interest in the intersection of public policy and archives. He's currently the Society of American Archivists liaison to the National Coalition for History, the premier history-related advocacy organization in the United States. After Bryan, we'll hear from Catherine J. Newsome, the state archivist and executive director of the Louisiana State Archives, a division of the Louisiana Secretary of State's office. In her position, she oversees the preservation and access to the permanent records for the state of Louisiana. She also oversees the records management policies and practices for all of Louisiana's state, parish, and local agencies. Prior to joining the Secretary of State's office in 2019, Catherine practiced law for 10 years in both the public and private sector. Her practice areas included criminal litigation, election law, and public records litigation. She received her law degree from the Paul M. Hubert Law Center at Louisiana State University and her undergraduate degree in journalism from Mississippi College. Catherine lives in Baton Rouge with her husband, Saul Newsome, who is an international trade and federal compliance attorney, and their 3 children. So with that, I will turn things over to Bryan.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And I'm traveling, so I apologize for the stereo in the background playing the pop hits of today. So we're going to talk about Archives on the Hill today, and it was a wonderful event this past year, and we'll give a little bit of a rundown of how we got there and what the next plans are. So as we start with the beginning on our following slide, we have we know that archivists have been doing public policy advocacy for a very long time. This just didn't start recently. It's been going on for a long time. In the mid-2010, archivists attended the National Humanities Alliance's Humanities Advocacy Day, and a couple of people who attended that were really inspired, and when we had a chance to meet in Washington, D.C. at the joint CoSA Nagara SAA meeting in Washington, perfect opportunity for archives to replicate one of these profession-specific advocacy days. So in 2018, we came together, and what did we accomplish? Well, we had 67 archivists who participated from 30 different states. We had meetings with 45 legislative staffs and staffers. We forged a few of the long-running connections with staff that have gone on to pay dividends for us as a profession. And we developed a few new champions for the archives advocacy within our profession. And I will say I'm one of them. So I got brought in 2018. A couple people said, you'd be a good fit. Why don't you do it? And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I fell in love with it. From that point, I became the chair of SAA's Committee on Public Policy, the liaison to the National Coalition for History, and one of the ringleaders of this year's Archives on the Hill event, as well as a liaison informally with the group National Humanities Alliance. And we'll talk about them a little bit in a moment. So there's a picture of Kathleen Rowe, somebody who has inspired me quite a bit, and April, one of my fellow Michiganders, in our Michigan Representatives Conference back in 2018, telling them why they should support archives. They know me well in that office now, so that's a good thing. So as we're moving on, we're looking at what we did to prepare for 2023. So Boston 2022, Joy Banks, the executive director of CoSA, and I were in the SAA meeting hotel in Boston, and we talked about, yeah, we're going to do this at the coming joint annual meeting there in Washington. So perfect opportunity. Let's bring this back again. So in late 2022, we formed the Archives on the Hill Coordinating Committee with members from CoSA, Nagara, and SAA. And there's a monthly meeting among advocacy folks from CoSA, Nagara, and SAA. So we can constantly update each other on these type of things. It's not something that involves an extraordinary amount of effort to facilitate the communication. We communicate once a month and more through regular emails, but once a month we have a meeting. So to be able to bring this up was a really good point. We also applied for an SAA Foundation grant because when this was put on in 2018, SAA really devoted a lot of staff time to this effort. And with SAA's office in a state of transition with a lot of new employees, we knew that that wasn't going to be, we couldn't expect as much. So we applied for a grant, which would have paid for an intern and some printing costs and some other things. Unfortunately, we didn't get the grant, but SAA did see what the budget was and it was laid out. And the big thing, the intern, SAA was willing to commit to that. So we were really fortunate for that. CoSA definitely chipped in quite a bit as well with effort and some materials, some printouts, some folders and folder stuffing. And Joy can tell you about folder stuffing sometime. So what were we aiming to accomplish when we did this in 2003? Well, I'll start with the last one on here, which is developing skills for legislative advocacy. We hoped that in 2018 event would do that, right? And then it would become a self-sustaining effort. But it turns out that we got a couple of champions. We didn't get a cadre of 25 champions, we got a couple. And so that one is still part of it, developing skills for legislative advocacy. The hope is one day that within the archives profession, we've got 30 of us who just do this. It's what we do it all the time, and we're good at it. But right now, we're probably at about 15 who do it regularly with a lot of oomph behind it. So that was one. We also wanted to raise awareness in Congress of archival issues. Meeting in July or August is not the ideal time to meet with representatives' offices, but it still works. We can start forming those relationships. And we're there to strengthen connections and the impact for archives. And so that is about letting our colleagues in the National Humanities Alliance or the National Coalition for History know that we are there and we're doing this. That way, when we need some help, they jump in and help us. They know they can count on us. National Humanities Alliance says to a few of us in the archives group regularly, when they need people to mobilize, they are thrilled with the response from archivists. They see archivists mobilize very quickly. Turns out we're really good at getting things done. We, especially state archivists, so we can mobilize quickly and they appreciate that. So we had to plan to get this done. And when we thought about planning, how do we get all this done? We drew on a lot of previous experience. Again, there are people who have done this. Kathleen Rowe, Barbara Teague, formerly of CoSA, a lot of individuals who've done this for a very long time. And so there's no reason to reinvent the wheel. And Dennis Riley was kind of the ringleader of the last event. He came up with the idea and he really pushed for it. So we drew on them. We said, what can we have? What kind of information do we need? What kind of planning do we have? And so they were both really instrumental. We're not reinventing anything here. We're drawing on past experience. We also relied on post-pandemic Hill visits, tips from our friends in the National Humanities Alliance, and I'll probably say NHA a little bit more now that we've seen the acronym. 2 or 3 of us attended NHA Day, which is every March in Washington, D.C. Archivists are encouraged to attend because the humanists love the archive stories. It's so easy to sell their message with our stories. So we want the humanists want us to join them, and that's a good thing. And so by attending NHA Day, first in-person NHA day since 2019. Well, no, 2020, because we did have it in the pandemic year as it was settling in. But first one in person in a few years, we could get some tips about how this is going to run, right? January 6th, the pandemic, what's the Capitol Hill gonna be like? So being able to go in person, it was nice to see it. And we could set up a calendar for accomplishments. What are we going to accomplish by what dates? And I appreciate everybody who was on the planning, the coordinating committee for bearing with me as a bottleneck. The biggest part of our planning that it turned out, in my eyes, was we relied a lot on Alex Klein from National Humanities Alliance. So that's Alex. So when you hear about the NHA, Alex really came through for us quite a bit with help. Alex facilitated connections so we could book rooms. Alex facilitated or gave us some information about how to do the scheduling. A lot of folks in Washington, D.C. will say, oh, hire a scheduler. Well, a scheduler might come in at $10,000, $15,000. Alex came in and said, no, we do this in-house and you guys are only going to schedule 50 to 100 meetings. You can do this with an intern, no problem. So we could use her advice a lot. And so much appreciation to Alex for really connecting the archives, which doesn't have a robust lobbying or advocacy infrastructure, with her and the NHA's robust lobbying infrastructure to give us those tips, avoid landmines and ease our way into into Washington. So planning also involved recruiting advocates. We recruited via just general announcements and word of mouth. We contacted past participants. At this year's Archives on the Hill, we had a lot of veterans. And we contacted folks who we thought would be good. And I don't know what the definition of that is, but just people who we know who can sell our message, can work hard, and can really, we know will show up and we know we'll be right on point. So initially we had about 55 interested folks. We got down to 40 the day of, but that's still good. The biggest part of scheduling, of planning, was our scheduling. And this is what really brought us, really was where the work was. So we could use members, their geographic locations. We could identify senators and representatives really easily. And we had our intern scheduler. But we had a lot of considerations, right? The availability of some individuals. Some people had to leave by 1 to make it to the CoSA events on Tuesday afternoon. Some people couldn't be there before 11 because of the way their flights got in. We had House and Senate considerations, right? When you leave the House side, you have to exit outside and go through security again on the Senate side, and the same going back. And then we wanted to pair up teams of states because we had about, of our 40, 20 people who I could consider veterans and probably 10 who were solid leads for teams. So we wanted to make sure that we teamed up people with team leads that would help them. So for instance, I was with Maine, and Kate McBrien was perfect partner in crime in this, but she hadn't done it. So being able to be with Kate, where I could be the team lead and she's taking the lead in all of the meetings with Maine, but I'm helping to facilitate where we're going, what we're doing, setting the tone with the initial, how do you jump into the ask? And one of my colleagues sent me a note, and it said, from what I understand, it's like nailing Jello to the wall, and he was absolutely 100%. I tell you, if you want to punish yourself, give this to yourself as an assignment, scheduling Capitol Hill visits, just because, as we'll see in our following slide, it led to about 3 weeks of nail biting. So we were told, don't call too early. They won't schedule meetings more than 2 weeks out, 3 weeks out. We had a ton of unanswered phone calls and a ton of unanswered emails. The Friday before, we were still scheduling meetings because we'd have legislators who'd say, oh, we don't know what the schedule is next week, or, oh, I can't meet Tuesday until 4 p.m. And then we'd get an email back that said, oh, I can meet now at 1 p.m. if you have a 1 p.m. slot. And we'd say, oh, well, we're on the Senate side at noon. How do we get back over to the House side for this 1 p.m. meeting? And it was quite difficult. We also had to worry about travel, as I mentioned, and meeting space availability was quite nail biting. But as Kathleen told me, it'll all come together in 15 minutes after things get moving. You'll see it'll be fine. And she was absolutely right. It all did come together. And so what did we accomplish? Well, we had 40 archives advocates, which included a couple of non-archivists. And that was really important to us, right? We want friends of archives to also advocate for archives. If we're just doing this alone, You know, there's what, 20, 30,000 of us nationwide. That doesn't even fill a baseball stadium. We need partners in crime who are willing to come with us. So we had some veterans, we had some rookies. Every person was excellent. It really was a great group. Out of our 20 states represented, we could get scheduled with 55 different meetings with legislative staffs. And that was a really important thing, to get much face time as possible. Some people had some wonderful meetings. Some people had some mediocre meetings. I don't think anybody had a horrible meeting, which for all of you who work with government advocacy, you know that you're not going to have horrible meetings. You're going to have less than great meetings. And best part is we got a couple prospective new champions out of this. So if we look at some of the photos, right, we got learning done. We were on Capitol Hill. It truly was a great thing. And for those who traveled with people who've been in Washington, D.C. before, like Kate and Lisa from the Michigan Maine group, we even got a ride on the Senate subway by saying, you know, we got a really tight schedule and it's kind of hot outside, and Senate intern takes us on the subway. So what can we do going forward? Well, Americans Archives Month is a chance for us to reach out to our legislative staffs. And I put maybe in there because they kind of have some bigger fish to fry starting Saturday at 11:59 p.m. So are we really going to be able to do much outreach during this time? Our staff's really going to be receptive to our messages when they're dealing with a federal shutdown, but they might be receptive. So we're still going to do some outreach. We're going to draw on the teams of the Archives advocates to bring some messages to DC policymakers. There's a big message coming up about some possible large-scale funding for the National Archives and NHPRC. And the goal is going to be, well, let's start to seed that idea within our follow-up messages during Archives Month. We're talking about undertaking another Archives on the Hill event. We'd probably do it virtual if we're going to do it at any point where it's only archivists, simply because in-person is tricky. Everybody has to get to Washington, D.C. Even when we had the joint CoSA SAA meeting, if we looked at west of the Mississippi River, we only had about 4 states represented. So people can get to Washington easily if it's New York, Rhode Island, the Carolinas. If people are west of the Mississippi, or even me in Michigan, that becomes an expensive plane trip and a hotel stay, and asking people to make that sacrifice is a little beyond maybe what we could be comfortable with. But we can all go to Washington, D.C. for NHA Day, and the archivists are always welcome. And as I said, our stories are really consequential to the stories that they tell. When they want to make a connection with their legislators, the archives are things that are concrete that they can understand. So that's where we are with Archives on the Hill. I look forward to hearing from a few of the names that I saw who were there, because I hope that they had an enjoyable time, but also picked up some tips and got rid of the butterflies. And I thank you all for listening. I look forward to answering to some questions later.
All right, I think this is where I pick up. And so thank you so much, Bryan. I appreciate an overview of Archives on the Hill. Unfortunately, I was not able to be there. So I appreciate him coming in and stepping in to tell us about that. What I'd like to talk to you about is advocacy for your state government, and how you as a state archivist or as an employee of a state archives can advocate for your programming, and how that really can be effective. And so we're going to take a look at the Louisiana State Archives building. And this is an interesting first slide to start my presentation, but this actually is a picture of advocacy. And that is because when I started with the State Archives in 2019, the State Archives building was not the beautiful pearly whitish color that you see there. It was brown and gray and very dingy. It had not been pressure washed in many, many years. And so I worked with my facility manager to advocate for facility planning to actually come out and pressure wash our building. And believe it or not, that is very expensive. So over $100,000 of appropriation of state funds had to be allocated for the pressure washing of the state archives. But now on a daily basis, we get compliments on how great the building looks. And so just wanted to share that with you. But when you're thinking about advocating for your state archives, we need to talk about organizational structure. So whether or not you are a part of a Secretary of State's office or an executive branch like a governor or lieutenant governor, or a part of your state education system, when you're thinking about how to advocate, don't just think about the legislature. You need to think about what branch of government you are a part of so that you can start with the archives, go up and across, and then back down. And also you're wanting to think about your organizational structure. So I'm going to briefly go over the organizational structure at the Louisiana State Archives. The archives administration and facility management is really what, as state archivist, I focus on. So I am manning the administrative business side of the archives and also the facility. So everything that's happening in the building and all of the programs that are happening in the building. I know from visiting other archives and speaking to you all, some people are in shared spaces, so you don't have the whole building. You might be in a building shared with the library or other executive branches. And so when advocating for your space, you really have to partner with other people who have shared space with you, if you have that, or if you're on your own, then really talking about your programming and how your building facilitates your programming and your programming facilitates the building. That's really important. So let's talk about programming at the Louisiana State Archives. We have 5 main divisions. We have our collections management section, which includes both document processing and audio visual. We have our reference services section, which is our reference library and our vital records section. We have imaging and preservation services, which is our conversion services for both state, local, and we do conversion services for in-house. So like the Secretary of State, clerks of court, registrars of voters. We have our reference services section, which is our statewide records management program. We regulate over 4,000 state, parish, and local government agencies. And then the Records Center is for utilization of temporary records for state agencies. And we have our conservation services, which is our conservation lab and our exhibits department. And the exhibits department brings a lot of people to the building. And so that program/building aspect of advocacy is super important when it comes to that. So I want to talk about stakeholders. We've talked about organizational structure and how we're going to think about, going up to that higher level, and then also down into how can you use your programs to advocate for your state archives. So when you're talking about internal stakeholders, this is really important. It is your executive suite, if you're a part of an elected official's office, your human resources, your IT and your accounting, perhaps your legal team as well, if you have records management under your branch. And so I want to talk about how can you get in good with those internal stakeholders. Everybody should know your name, whether you are a processing archivist or a digital archivist, or you're in upper management, or you're the state archivist. All of those department heads should know your name, so that when you have a problem with your technology, or you have a problem with a bill that you sent out, or you're, having issues with a hiring process of an employee, those people are your advocates. And so it's important to take those internal stakeholders and think of them as external customers. Think about how you can provide a service to them. I think about our digital imaging and preservation services section that does digitization for our commercial division. So under the Secretary of State's office, all of our LLC and commercial business filings are filed here. And a lot of our customers are internal customers. So think about how having those good relationships when it comes to advocating at the legislature or advocating with a different branch of government, how those other programs within your own agency could support the mission that you're trying to accomplish. External stakeholders, that's when things get tricky. So maybe you have to report to the Division of Administration with performance indicators. Maybe you have a state civil service program, or I mentioned facility planning earlier. And since we are in a state building, we have to work very closely with facility planning as far as funding for our building if it's not something that we have in our self-generated funds. And then, of course, the dreaded legislature, where most of us who have to do policy and such and budgeting, you spend a lot of your year at the state legislature. And so I try to remind people that you have to create a compelling reason of why that stakeholder, whether they're internal or external, what are you doing that benefits them? And so making sure that they know about your programming is part of that. So next, we are going to talk about opposition. We talked a little bit about making friends. Now let's think about who your adversaries might be. For us, the legislative auditor, even though we all love auditors, they're wonderful, and we try to have great relationships with them. Most of us as government agencies have someone who we have to report to. So when you're thinking about whatever program that you're advocating for, whether or not it's an expansion of employees or it's expansion of your budget, how will this affect the people who you have to report to? I also like to point out associations. In Louisiana, we have parishes instead of counties, and all of our parish officials really like the concept of associations. So all of the sheriffs, they're all in an association together. The clerks of court are in an association together. The municipal clerks are in an association together. And so one effective tool that we have found is that whenever we want to make a legislative policy change that might affect records management or record keeping or otherwise of any of these different groups of people, reach out in advance to these associations to get their buy-in so that they're not coming to the legislature in opposition of you. And the key players in those associations are not always the elected official. Oftentimes, associations will have a full-time employee who's either a lawyer or an executive director. And so find out who you affect in advance and reach out to those people so that they don't show up on committee hearing day and put in a red card against your legislation. So also make friends. Chief deputies, executive assistant, law clerks, and staff attorneys. I have a kind of interesting story about this. The Secretary of State's office, all of their legislation goes through two different committees, the House Governmental Affairs Committee or the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee. And for my first 2 years as state archivist, I tried really, really hard to get in with those committee chairs, try to bump into them in the hallway so that I could introduce myself and all of that. And it wasn't until 2 sessions ago that I figured out the key. And for us, it was not the committee chair, it was the staff attorney on the committee. I kept watching and I realized that she was constantly whispering in the ear of the committee chair because she had already read all of the legislation. She had done the research. And so I started reaching out to her, and I've gotten to the point now where when she sees legislation that's coming up that would affect records management, she actually emails me and asks me my opinion. And so I really feel like that's a small victory that I'm going to take away. So don't ignore those other staff members. So what is active advocacy? I would say be persistent. Sometimes you're going to have to put in your request with facility planning or your request with civil service for new positions year after year after year, but eventually you may get it. It might need to be a change in administration, a change in a governor, or that committee chairman that just finally listens to why your programming is important. So be persistent. The present part is, for me, I realized that there were sometimes, of course, if I have an item on the legislative committee agenda, I'm going to go to that hearing, right? Well, if you don't go to every committee hearing, something might come up that you didn't know was going to be on the agenda. And so there was a lot of times where I get an opportunity to testify, not because I was there on purpose for a legislation. I just happened to be present and always be prepared. So I always have all of my codes with me, any talking points for each one of my divisions. I always have with me a one-page cheat sheet that talks about each, what is collections management doing right now? What big projects does exhibits have going on? So that if the conversation goes to something that is of interest to the person I'm talking about, I have that right at the tip of my fingers. So a few successful projects that we have had here in Louisiana, I wanted to talk about a little bit. Funding for special projects and equipment. We constantly ask for new equipment, and we've been pretty successful in getting them. With technology changing, if you have a digitization program, always ask for the newest and latest scanner or printer or shredder or whatever piece of equipment that you can justify to the legislature that you need because something new is going on. I have found targeted equipment requests to the legislature to be highly effective. We actually, I've been seeing in the CoSA community that a lot of people are on hiring freezes, but then some of us have actually had some expansions. And in the 2022 legislative session, the state archives actually got one full-time employee allotted to us. And in the 2023 legislative session, we have 5 new positions that we've been allocated for. Now, just because they allocated doesn't mean that it's actually going to happen, but the funding has been allotted and the positions are available, but now we just have to go through the hoops. So with those increases, we've gone from about 35 full-time employees to the potential of 41, and we have about 9 or 10 part-time employees as well. So that was a pretty significant increase in our potential. TOs is what we call them, but those are full-time positions. Another thing that we always ask for at the legislature is an increase in our base budget. We can justify that not only for economic reasons, but just the cost of things going up, lawn service, diesel fuel for our generators, everything goes up. So if you can just sneak that in each time, ask for that increase. We also asked specifically for increase in reoccurring expenses. So we, from 2022 to 2023, saw a 40% increase in our electricity bill due to energy rates going up. And so we ask every year incrementally, and then this year we had to ask for an additional amount. So those things that you can do every year, and one year they might say yes. The last thing that's on the slide here is open meetings law. So I was receiving a lot of complaints over the last 2 years since COVID. During COVID, everyone was moving to virtual meetings, and with executive orders through our different governors and down from the federal government, some of those open meetings law were relaxed, and there were boards and commissions and other government agencies that were allowed to meet virtually. And I don't know about you guys, but in Louisiana during 2022, and for sure by the beginning of 2023, all of those temporary executive orders were starting to dissipate. And so we were no longer able to meet virtually for government body public meetings, which is good because, of course, the public has a right to have access to a meeting, but I knew that we had more that we could do. And so I had brought forward some legislation specifically to one of the archives boards. But in going to those legislative committee hearings, I realized that there was another legislator who had also put forth a similar bill. So I asked to partner with her, and that went really well. And what we realized with this was not just a convenience issue. This was not just about getting a quorum for a meeting, and it was not just about convenience of being able to attend a government meeting virtually, but this was actually a huge issue for the disabled community, because during COVID, the disabled community was able to participate because of virtual meetings, whether it was a physical disability or an audio or speech disability. Having the meeting being live streamed and for those disabled individuals to have the ability to attend virtually and use their accommodations that they had in their own home. So we heard so much from that community and caregivers of the disabled community who wanted to serve on boards and commissions and could not because they're caring for someone and not able to leave their home. So this year in 2023, we passed that legislation and it went into effect on August 1st of this year. So I'm really proud that Archives got to spearhead that for boards and commissions throughout our state and the disabled community. And if you want more information about that in particular, I'd be happy to share that with you. Not on the slide, but I was able to talk briefly with Lisa before we got started. We are right now setting up for early voting at the Archives. The State Archives has been an early voting site for many years here in our parish. And it's a great way to bring people who would otherwise not want to visit or not ever visit the Archives to have an opportunity to see our exhibits. So during early voting, depending on what kind of election it is, if it's presidential or gubernatorial, this year for us is statewide elections. And so we expect a large amount of people to come through the Archives. But during early voting week, we will have as little as 20,000 and up to 80,000 visitors in a 7-day period. So if you have never thought about being an early voting site and you think that's something that your Archives could accommodate, we have the line snake right through the Louisiana exhibit room. So every single person who comes to vote, before they go in to cast their vote, they have an opportunity to see our exhibit. So that's another way for you to advocate on behalf of your institution, but just to the general public instead of to a particular government group. So lastly here, I have a picture of some coffee and a notepad, because after you have really worked through the whole legislative session and put through everything that you wanted to get done, it's time for you to relax in your diligence and wait for your next opportunity to strike. But I want to tell you, I've learned that there is no rest, because as soon as the legislature gives you your budget, guess what? It's time for you to submit your new budget package for the following year. So that coffee break will probably only be about 5 seconds. So enjoy. I look forward to our discussions and any questions that you all might have.
Thank you to both of you for sharing your words of wisdom. At this point, we want to open up the discussion to any attendees who were at the Archives on the Hill event, or it doesn't even have to just be the Archives at the Hill event. If you just want to talk about your experience in advocacy for Archives. I know Alan and Damon from Connecticut had some things that they were willing to share with us. If you wanted to unmute yourselves.
Yeah, thank you, Christy. This is Alan from Connecticut. So Damon Munz and I, oh, there he is. This was our first time doing Archives on the Hill. We were very much rookies, but we went and visited our congressional delegation, both my House member and Damon's House member, and then our 2 senators. We knew that it wasn't going to necessarily be a hard sell, because most of our delegation loves history. In fact, my Congressman Larson, used to teach history and social studies, so we knew that wasn't necessarily going to be a hard sell. But we did want to go, and at least since we're in Washington D.C. For the annual meeting, to at least thank them for an earmark grant that we had received, and for their support for that. So we were able to talk about some of the things that Archives do for individuals and for protecting democracy, given everything that's happened in the last few years. And to just, as I mentioned, thank them, and also, hear anything that they might have to say. They were all very attentive. We were able to follow up with them afterwards. I don't know, Damon, if you have anything else you want to add.
Just to go along with what Alan was saying, really Bryan and his team really, put us at ease, because this was our first time and maybe, a little bit nervous going in, but they provided with all the talking points. So really to get the conversation started with our, with the staff members. So if anybody's thinking about doing this next time, it was a real good experience.
Yeah, I just echo that. Bryan and everyone, Alex and everyone as well, for the preparation, and also telling us to do our homework also helped. So we did that ahead of time to learn, even though we kind of know them, to make sure that we weren't missing anything, like double checking on if they were all involved in the American 250 Commission, which one of them wasn't. So we strongly urged them to get involved with that. And so that's also an important part.
Yep.
Thank you, Alan and Damon, for sharing your experiences with us. It looks like Jamie Awalt from Tennessee also had some things that he was willing to talk about.
Yes. Hi. I guess you all can hear me. I feel like I'm talking into a void here, but I just wanted to say this is my first experience with anything like Archives on the Hill. And so I was pretty nervous coming into it. I did not have any expectations of I don't want to say friendly, but certainly where Alan said, they had kind of some friends that they were talking to. I wasn't quite so sure how the discussions would go with my senator or House member. But what set me at instant ease were a couple of things. Bryan and all the team's logistics, coming up with, the schedules, all the footwork that they did allowed me to just focus on the message and not have to worry about, I knew that I could get to the meetings, especially since I had buddies. I was partnered with the state of Pennsylvania. So all that to be said is just being really prepared on the front end, which I felt they really helped so we could do that, and just kind of focusing on the specific ask and the pitch of one or two core issues that we were going to speak on, and providing specific examples about how that directly impacted the communities and their constituents. All of that made it a little easier. We had one sheet, I think, as Damon was just saying, about the senators and House members that NHA provided with their background, the caucuses, when they were elected, committees, and et cetera. I did not actually speak with either my senator or House member, but with legislative aides and staff persons. So I looked them up too. I did a lot of social media trolling and Googling to see if there was something that I could connect with those individuals on if I needed to in the meeting. Really worked out for a great example. When we were in Senator Haggerty's office, I had discovered that the legislative assistant that we were meeting with had been an intern with the Secretary of State, who is my boss. And so I knew he would know him. And through the discussion, learned that he had actually attended our big Statehood Day event at the Library and Archives last June. So where he did not make that connection that the Secretary of State was also over the state archives. And so that really kind of broke the ice and made it a really good discussion. So I just highly encourage people to do it. I'm looking forward to getting involved again. And I just really applaud everybody for making it a pretty painless day, even though it was really hot.
Thank you. Thank you, Jamie, for talking about your experience.
To Jamie and Alan and Damon's points, if you ever need a hand, there are people within CoSA, within SAA, who are willing to help. Tim Baker isn't here, but a couple of years ago said, "Hey Bryan, would you come with me? I'll do the talk, and if you can do and if you could just have some backup points, available from the National Association." It was great. And so now you all know that Jamie and Alan and Damon have some experience. So if you want to do something like this, you can schedule virtual meetings, no problem. And you can say, well, I have Alan here from the Council of State Archivists and my other colleague, Jamie, from the Council of State Archivists, and they'd like to talk a little bit about why this is important. And then you don't necessarily have to have all those numbers off the top of your head and all those things. You have support from some people who've done it before, and we're always happy to help. Simply reach out to those of us who've done it, and I think we'd all be happy to join in.
Exactly. That's really the key.
All right. Thank you. And I know that Dave Jones from the Illinois State Archives had some things he was going to talk about. I think we may need to unmute him. Dave, you are unmuted, but we are not able to hear you.
I see that Joy has a question. I'll just answer very quickly from the federal end of it. Legislative staffers are super happy to have virtual meetings still because they're really easy for them. And so they're happy to schedule virtual meetings. That's not a problem at all for the federal legislative staffers. I don't think you'll get legislators on the virtual calls. You'll get the staffers, but they do like it because it's easier for them. They don't have to have a meeting space or anything like that.
Okay. All right, I am going to go ahead and if we could unmute Kathy Popovich.
Well, this is fun. Dave's on his way. But before he gets here, actually, I'll kick in my 2 cents. So I was able to attend the Archives on the Hill event as well. And this was my first experience, and I will echo a lot of what Jamie and Alan and Damon said, that I felt very prepared because of all of the legwork that everybody did ahead of time. I actually had a fun experience in my last meeting. The staffer that I was meeting with pitched to me why archives were so important. So that was pretty neat. She had shared an experience that she had worked with the county archives and was just blown away by what she could do. So I would encourage you all, even if you don't feel comfortable in these kind of situations, you know more than you think you know, because I mean, you're the expert on your institutions and what you do every day. So Dave's here now, so I'll let him talk.
Hey, everybody. I just kind of want to tie in a little bit more to what Catherine had said about advocacy within your state. We don't deal directly very often with the legislature ourselves. We deal with our budget office, our fiscal services office, our personnel office. And the key to my mind is you don't just go to them when you need something. You know, it's a 365-day-a-year job to some extent. They need to know what you do and why it's important. So when you do go to them for an ask, you know, they understand. So when you say, hey, we need an electronic records archivist, they know what that is. Or we need special, we need a new HVAC unit to keep our temperature and humidity control in shape, and they know what you're talking about. So one of the key things is to advocate within your organization. And again, not just when you need something, but so that they know who you are and the special needs that we have. And that's just so important. It's also important to advocate, to look, kind of like networking, look for partnerships of people who can help you. And a good example of that for us is we've had the Supreme Court justices over here a couple of times to look at our records, to look at their records actually. And we had a scanning project we needed because their records are in lousy shape, and they endorsed it and supported it. And we got a grant because we had a partnership. We had, you know, it's not what you would normally think is advocacy, but because we had worked these guys, because they knew who we were and what we did, we were able to get a grant. And right now we're scanning thousands of Supreme Court records. So that's real important. So they know what you do and they know what you need beforehand. You don't just do it, you know, when you need something. You don't just do it at budget time. So that's all I wanted to note.
Thank you. Are there any other attendees who would be willing to talk about their experiences at Archives on the Hill, or anything else related to advocacy and archives? You can drop things in chat or raise your hand.
Did want to tell you all that on one of our last advocacy calls, Dave shared this story along with some others with us, and we have decided to coin a phrase, and props goes to Dave. This is his phrase, but what Dave is talking about is called micro advocacy. So
yeah, one other thing I'd like to toss in too is, again, talking about that, we belong to a bigger organization. Don't silo yourself into just being in the archives. So, you know, I'm on committees within Secretary of State's office that have nothing to do with archives. I'm on a front office committee, for example. I'm on a library committee. I'm on a budget committee called Reasonable Accommodation, a budget committee on procurement. And I learned a couple things. I learned a lot of inside information about procurement, which helps me, but these really have nothing to do with archives. But they know who I am and I know who they are. And I also learned how other offices, especially personnel and budget and physical services, how they operate, which helps me when I need to advocate. They know me and I know what they need.
Great. I'm not seeing any other hands raised or anything in the chat, so we can move on to questions and answers. If you have any questions, you can put them in chat, raise your hand, and we can unmute you. We did have some questions to start off with. My first question is for Bryan. We've heard that ALA and other organizations have lobbyists, and the National Humanities Alliance people you relied on seem to do this stuff all the time. Why doesn't the archives profession hire a lobbyist?
So lobbyists are expensive, and we're talking six figures, and we as professional organizations just don't have that kind of extra funds laying around. Again, we're small, 30,000 of us nationwide call ourselves archivists or so, I mean, that's rough estimate. And if that's what we have, we can't expect that small group. ALA is huge, hundreds of thousands. So of librarians nationwide are represented there. So what we do instead is rely on us as volunteers to do this legwork. What Dave and Catherine talking about the micro advocacy. The people in those meetings that Dave mentioned, one of them gets a promotion or one of them joins the national and now they're at the federal or now they're working for NHPRC, or these are all these connections that we need to rely on ourselves. So that's one reason we don't have lobbyists. It's just expensive. We also partner then with our organizations that can represent us, right? And legislators, even sometimes depending on what department and your bosses may not even know what the archives are or what an archivist is. So to be able to work with the humanist who can say, well, we're historians and these are the people who help us make history accessible, that is a message that resonates. It might not be exactly what we want, but everybody loves Henry Louis Gates. So if you just say, yeah, that's archives, that's what we do, leave it there. That's a good thing, and winning and getting more money based on a misconception we don't need to correct everybody all the time. So that's why we don't have lobbyists. It's just too expensive.
All right, the next question I have is for Catherine. What is the most bang that you got for your buck in advocating for your agency, or the least amount of effort but the most impact?
I think the equipment request to the legislature, when I think we think about archives, we feel so pressed for money, and as an institution, oftentimes we are. And so you look at a $50,000 microfilm scanner, or you look at a $20,000 high-speed printer or whatever, and it seems astronomically expensive. But if it's a line item request on a huge legislative package and they're nitpicking the things that are in the millions and millions of dollars or the hundreds of millions of dollars, don't be afraid to ask for that $20,000 piece of equipment, because it just might slide through. So I think I'm often surprised at what comes back from the legislature that gets approved. For instance, this year we got a cargo van, and that's huge. We've never had a cargo van to do pickups and such, but it was $60,000 and the legislature didn't bat an eye. So just ask and you might get it.
Great. I have another question for Bryan. Yes, how can I join in these efforts? Where do I hear about them?
So hearing about it, ideally we're posting it to some of the big lists that hopefully you all are on, CoSA lists, Society of American Archivists lists, Nagara lists. That's where we'll talk about it. Also word of mouth. I am guessing, I'm hoping, my fingers are crossed, that Kathy Popovich and Jamie and Damon and Alan are all now proselytizers for this. So the next time they hear something, they're going to spread the word and you can get involved. If you would like to do something, Archives Month coming up, if you'd love to schedule a virtual Hill visit, I think I am pretty simple to search. I'm the only Bryan with a Y with the last name Whitledge anywhere in the world. So if you look me up, you'll find me. And I'd be happy to tag along with you to a virtual visit with your legislative staffers. So getting involved is just a matter of raising your hand. And advocacy is something that you can come and go as you need to. So if you've got some time, you've got some spare effort, you can do it. And then as Catherine's mentioning, maybe she's got to be full time there in Louisiana going to legislative sessions, because she never knows when her agency might be brought forward. And you know what? That's okay. She doesn't have time to do the federal stuff. So that's fine. Maybe 5 years from now, she's able to do some federal advocacy. So she comes into the fold. And then if things come back, she goes back out. So that's a great one. I see that there is about the official advocacy committee for CoSA, and I'll let Joy or somebody else handle that. Within SAA, there is an advocacy committee. It is appointment only, and the appointments are kind of selective. But if you're really into it, if you send me an email, I'll tell you how to get by the people who do the selection so that you can become part of the Committee on Public Policy. That would be within SAA. I think Joy or somebody else might be able to help with the CoSA question.
Yeah, Joy, are you able to unmute yourself to address Natalie's question? Never mind. I think it was answered in chat.
Yes, and yes,
Oh.
there is. We do have an advocacy committee. Catherine, I hope you've written down Natalie's name. I will do the same. But yeah, we meet monthly. The group kind of goes back and forth between a federal focus and activities that will support our CoSA member institutions more specifically. So, for example, we've been working on some response if the federal government shuts down. We've been working to revise our importance of state archives publication to be more usable and customizable for advocacy locally. And we're working on some projects that will help to boost archival involvement in the presence with America 250 efforts. So we have an open door policy for CoSA's committees. So anyone else that might be interested in joining that, do let us know.
I do have one more question for Catherine. What is one thing you did wrong that you hope no one else would do in advocacy?
Oh, that's a good one. So I was at a committee hearing one time and I was being peppered with questions, and the committee chair kept referring to the APA. And I am a journalist prior to being a lawyer and prior to being an archivist. And I kept thinking that she was talking about this Associated Press, the Associated Press. Why is she asking me a question about the Associated Press? And it got down and down the line. And I had always heard the APA in Louisiana referred to as this procedural code, but it's actually called the Administrative Procedural Act. So the APA, and I did not realize it. And so I was, instead of just taking the time to ask a question, I went on and on and on about things that made absolutely no sense. And so if you're ever being questioned about something and someone uses an acronym that you don't know, just don't be an idiot. Ask a simple question so you don't waste people's time. That was very embarrassing and recorded. So.
Right, that is very good advice. Thank you for that. I am not seeing any other questions in the chat or any hands raised, so I'm going to go ahead and turn this back over to Lisa.
And
Thank you, Christy. Go
just to
ahead, Bryan.
Just to Catherine's point, which is really actually a really good one about asking the questions, please don't use archives acronyms with people. They don't know what we're doing. Please don't do it. Just speak plainly. You know, nobody knows what a SIP or a DIP or an APE is. Just please don't. I am trying to make sure that archives are communicated effectively with the public, and I think state archivists do a much better job than some of my colleagues in other areas. But yeah. So to Catherine's point, yeah, you're completely right. I've been in that same conversation, and I think I shot myself in the foot by constantly using acronyms, and the poor legislative staffer never asked me what any of them were, and I've never really talked to them since. So I think that's exactly what it is.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Catherine, for your great presentations. We hope that you enjoyed today's webinar, and we hope that you'll be part of our future webinars. CoSA has a standing webinar the last Thursday of each month, and that's what we call our member webinar. We're excited for next month's webinar, our Archives Month one. We're again going to do what we call our State Archives Spotlight, and we're going to be looking at 2 archives. We're going to be looking at Pennsylvania, and David Carmichael is going to be sharing his new building, we hope. And then we're also going to be talking to Jim Hemphill in American Samoa. And he's going to be sharing with us information about what the archives looks in his territory. Now, if you notice, the time is 3:30 instead of 3 o'clock Eastern. And that's because we're trying to be nice to Jim because it's very early in his morning. So we hope you'll register for that and join us for a member webinar. In addition to that, we have our SERI webinars. And October 10th is coming up. And for hopefully you all know, that's Electronic Records Day. And they've got some great programs planned for that. So again, to go to the SERI website and under the CoSA website and register for that. In addition to that, we also have another shop talk coming up. Our sponsors, our vendor sponsors, have an opportunity to share what they're doing with you. And so our next one is in November 9th with Preservica. So again, it's a great way. It's not a sales pitch. But hopefully that they're going to do is explain some of the work they're doing or what some of their new products are. And maybe you don't need it now, but it might be something you learn about. So next year, if you're like Catherine and you get one of those legislative appropriations for some new software, you can say, hey, this particular vendor has something I think could be useful for us. So definitely look at doing that. So in addition to that, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, there's a lot of ways to contact us. As always, reach out to us at our website, at our Facebook page, and of course, you can watch any of our recorded webinars on YouTube. Next. Of course, none of this is possible without our sponsors, and so we thank all of them and hope that you do too. If you're working with them, say, hey, we appreciate that you support the Council of State Archivists. And lastly, we want to thank all of you for joining, and I believe we will have a link to an evaluation. We hope you'll take a minute and answer those questions. It really does help our education committee to get ideas for things as we go forward. And with that, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your day, rest of your week, and we hope we'll see you at the next CoSA member webinar. Thank you so much. Take care.